Hello, class. I wanted to take a few minutes and walk you through some of the material for this week. As you know, we are discussing biases and heuristics. Heuristics is just another term that many cognitive psychologists, some behavioral economists use to describe a process or a shortcut or a rule that the human mind follows often to solve problems. And the issue can be that under certain specific circumstances, those rules can yield bad answers. And just like we learned a little bit last week about System 1 versus System 2 and the shortcomings that can arise from when we mistakenly fail to shift into System 2 from System 1, this picks up on that and describes some very specific instances of that we can use. We are going to hop into a presentation now. Okay, so here we are, biases and heuristics. Let's talk a little bit. We have an outcome for our class about evaluating the support for claims in terms of their acceptability, relevance, and sufficiency. And what this week amounts to is around acceptability, but also relevance. We might be inclined to support or not to support a claim based on certain factors which may not be purely logical, but which could be more cognitive. It could have to do with these kinds of heuristics that we're going to be talking about this week. If we're on guard, then we will know what to do. And what is that? What will we do? Well, this chapter and this material, both this week and last week, is not done so that we can deploy it in our criticism or evaluation of someone else. The idea is that we use it on ourselves. We say to ourselves, I'm in a situation where I could potentially be being misled by the fact that something is easy to recall, or that it's emotionally charged, or that it's very concrete and not abstract. And if we know that, then we can make some adjustments. And what kind of adjustments are we going to be making? Well, here's where I want to talk credence just a little bit, and I will shrink that down just a smidge. So the degree to which you believe a proposition or a statement is called your credence. And this is a subjective matter. There may be some beliefs you hold, which you hold to, let's say, the degree of 85%. You're pretty sure, you're very certain, but not certain that they're true, right? 85% is really high. There might be other beliefs you have that you still believe, so it's greater than 50% credence, but which you're not so sure about. Maybe you think it's more likely than not, but not by a lot. So maybe you're only 60% confident in those, right? Some you might just have zero. So look at the example, right? 2 plus 2 is 5. What credence do you attach to that? Zero, right? Zero means no credence whatsoever. You believe it's necessarily false, zero chance of being true. There aren't going to be many propositions like that. So I have a fairly high credence, if we're going on a scale of 0 to 10, that the Earth is 4.54 billion years old, right? Lots of experts say so. When they all look independently, they come up with the same kinds of answers. They all use the same kind of radiometric dating or whatever it is, and they get very similar answers. I'm close to being completely convinced, right? But we know, they could turn up new evidence tomorrow. They could move that number a little bit here or there. So maybe I won't go 100% like I would with something like 2 plus 2 equals 4, but it's high. So that's just an example of credence. And how will we use this? Well, we are going to think about situations where we should dial back our credence in the very conclusions we ourselves are reaching. So suppose we have a friend, Jane, and she says, a car burned in my neighborhood last night around 10 p.m. Well, normally, if your friend tells you something and you have no reason to disbelieve them and it's not a fantastic claim about Martians or aliens or something, you might just believe them, right? Like, yeah, 90% Jane never lies to me. I believe Jane. But if I added in some information, you might start to dial back your confidence in Jane. Suppose she was drunk last night at 10. She wasn't wearing her glasses. And then you see a news report from an outlet that says a car burned in her neighborhood at 8, not 10. Well, now you have independent evidence that it was at 8, not 10. And, she's unreliable because she was drunk and not wearing her glasses. So you might dial back your credence. We're going to do the same thing when we are thinking about these kinds of biases and heuristics that we're going to look at. If the availability error is in play or something becomes emotionally charged, we should dial back our confidence because we know that kind of emotionally charged conversation can lead to mistakes or errors. So this is where biases come in. We know a great deal. We, scientists, cognitive scientists, behavioral psychologists, and those kind of folks, they know a great deal about how the human mind and the human cognitive system work. we can use that to help us make appropriate credences. We want to believe to an appropriate degree. We don't want to be overconfident in a belief that doesn't warrant it, and we don't want to be underconfident when we have good evidence to be confident. And knowing the information we're about to learn can help us with that. So here's an example, and I'm going to show you a few more here in a minute. So confirmation bias. Many people look first or look only for information that confirms what they already believe. Well, we probably know this, right? You can even think about your own case. Don't out yourself, but if you think about your own case, you might say, hey, I'm on the political spectrum here, and I suspect if we were to get news about politics, we would probably find news sources that also align with that. If we're a so-called lefty, maybe we get our news from an MSNBC or something, and if we're a righty, maybe we get our news from Fox News, and if we're kind of in the middle, maybe we go CNN or NPR, I don't know. But whatever the case may be, it's probably the case that many of us get our information from sites that give the kinds of information that we already want. And that's only going to confirm what we already think about many things. And this is not an optimal strategy. For starters, you'll never learn that you're wrong, or I'll never learn that I'm wrong. And I want to know, right? I want the appropriate credence for my beliefs. And if there's evidence against my belief that I'm failing to consider, I want to know what that is. What does the best story look like? Well, this is not a bias or heuristic, let me be clear. Genuine confirmation, not a mistake, right? This is the real deal. So instead of trying to look for information for our hypotheses, we should instead try to look for information against them. We should try to disconfirm our hypotheses. In that way, we narrow our search. Lots of things might confirm our hypothesis, but only a few things truly refute it. So if we look for those things, that's a better strategy. It's more effective at determining falsehood. If you find that, you know you were wrong. And if you don't find it, well, that's good news, right? You're probably right. So real confirmation, we're going to say, is when you try to prove yourself wrong, but fail. That's a good thing for our beliefs. And after all, if our beliefs are true, what do we have to be afraid of, right? Let's try to prove them wrong and see if we can. Okay, and one of the safest way to do this, and we'll spend a lot more time later talking about expertise, when we should trust experts, when we might not want to trust experts, what is an expert, and so on. We'll spend some time on that later. But for now, a good shorthand is, when a whole lot of experts agree with one another, it's a good idea to place your bets that they're probably right, or at least to ratchet up our credence. That's at least if we're not experts, right? So I am not an expert in physics. I am not an expert in biology. There's, take your pick on the things I am not an expert in. On those areas, it's a good idea. It's a safe bet for me to bet with the experts. Doesn't mean they can't be wrong. Doesn't mean I couldn't be wrong. But we're talking about placing bets and adjusting our credences appropriately. And if we do that, I suspect we'll find that we're closer to right more often than we're closer to wrong. Okay, in any case, first things first, let's talk about the availability error. This is the first bias or heuristic that we're going to look at. We saw a little bit of this in the Kahneman. The way Kahneman would describe it is the availability error is when we take what System 1 delivers us, easy to recall information, and we fail to apply System 2. But we can also say it's judging by the first thing that comes to mind. And the reason we do this is because some things come to mind first. They're more salient than other things. You can even think of lotteries here. You can think of a lottery. And what is the payout for a lottery? Well, at the time I made this presentation, there was a lottery whose payout was $58 million. It was the Powerball. Now it's up over 200, I think, as of the recording of this video. But if you bought a ticket, you might think, oh, that's a great idea, right? What a good thing. But no, right? The odds for winning that lottery were worse than the payout. But why do we talk about lotteries? Hold up on the halo effect for just a second. Why do we talk about lotteries? Because what's the first thing you think of when you think of a lottery? You might think of, I'm going to get a house in the Bahamas. I'm going to pay off my debts and buy my mom a new house and do all these kinds of great things. What do you or we often not think of? Missing rent because I bought lottery tickets, or the people who go to the casino and gamble away child support payments, or whatever the negative stereotype is around gambling. Here's what we do know for sure. Forget stereotypes. Here's what we know. The casino wins more money than they lose, which means most people lose money at gambling. We know this going in. We know buying lottery tickets is not a good strategy for amassing wealth. We get it. So The reason we might think it's a better idea than it is because of something like the availability error. We've had it pushed into our heads to think of the good things and not the bad. Since that's the first information that occurs to us, we might think that is most likely. That would be an error. Failure to engage system 2 in the Kahneman terms. We can also talk about the halo effect. This is a great one. This is where you can think, this works for objects too that are not human, but you can think of it in terms of people. So sometimes people have properties, and a property is a highly salient property. And I'm going to define salience here in a minute, but I just want to talk to you a little bit about it more intuitively at first. A salient property is just any property that really stands out for now. And some people have properties that really stand out, and that property could be a good property or it could be a bad property. If it's a good property that's highly salient, that might make us overestimate other properties that person has. Right? Maybe I'm hiring for a job and I pull up a resume and it says Harvard on it. Well, I might say, oh, sheesh, they went there. I might overinflate some of their qualifications in other areas because I might have a positive association with that school and they have it, right? So that's a property of theirs that might make me overvaluate other of their properties. But it works negatively too, right? So imagine someone comes in for a job interview and I, the not very progressive boss, see tattoos on them, right? I might use this to form a negative judgment about their performance and say, I can see all these things. Just imagine what they're like out in the real, there's no way they're good at, you see where I'm going, right? That highly salient negative trait might make me devalue other traits they have. So when it's a positive trait, it's the halo effect. And when it's a negative trait, it's the devil effect. But it happens a lot. There have been studies, I think I mentioned one in the book, and I just leave it an open-ended question, where you can take resumes and submit them to the same job, and all you do is change the name, right? You can change Michael to Miguel, or you change John to Juan, and you see what the responses you get. And surprise, surprise, right? The Miguels and the Juans do worse on callbacks than the Michaels and the Johns, despite the resumes being identical. Something like the halo effect, or the devil effect in this case, is going on, right? Someone at some level is making decisions, and their judgment is getting clouded, right? They're failing to look at the actual details on the resume that matter, and they're being misled maybe by some of the associations they're making between the name. Sure, there are some cases where it's just outright racism, of course, right? But it could also be something slightly less conscious, like the devil effect. Okay, so what makes something available? Well, we've got 4 primary things. Something that's recently presented is going to make something more available. Something that produces strong emotion or that's dramatic, and something that leads to the formation of images or that's concrete. So these are all things that make something more available. They make it easier for our minds to digest. Something recent, if I asked you what meal you ate for dinner yesterday, you could probably tell me. Maybe even if I said a week ago, you might be able to tell me. You go, it's a Tuesday. I know what I normally eat on Tuesdays. I know Wednesday I went out with my friend, right? You could probably come up with it. If I said 7 months and 3 days ago, good luck, right? Even with a calendar, it might be hard to pull that before our mind's eye. And things that produce strong emotion are available. Think of sentiment. Think of first loves or songs that meant a lot to us, or first books we read that really had an impact on us, right? Those things produce a strong emotion, and I bet we can remember that for a long time. Someone mentions that book, it's so great. Like we are immediately going to have a positive association with it, or in some cases, a negative association. But that will make that information much more available to us than if there was no such emotional association. So just some things that can make some information more available than others. And here are some real-life availability errors. You might think, which is safer, a fairground ride or a bike ride? Well, it's a fairground ride, right? Or is it? It is. You're 40 times as likely to be killed cycling on main roads for an hour as if you'd spend the same amount of time riding fairground machines. That shows you the fairground machines are safer. But yet I bet a lot of people have a negative association with rides. Maybe because when there is a tragic accident, it makes the news, it's tragic, everyone talks about it, and that's less likely to happen with cyclists. So one piece of information is more available to us. The tragedies around fair rides, that makes it easier to recall. We stop system 2 from engaging. We rely on the available information to guide our behavior, not the accurate information. So it's suboptimal. And why is it suboptimal? Well, I bet if we really sat down and thought about it and engaged system 2, we could figure out the truth. We would say, why do I only think of the tragedies? Could it be because of the news and how sensationalized the news is? Yes. How many cyclists are there? How many accidents do I hear about, right? If we thought about it, we would at least be able to suss out the fact that it's not representative information we're relying on, and one probably is safer than we think. We could at least get there if we were more careful. And you can think of insurance in a casino. We don't have to get too much into gambling. This is not a class in gambling, but in a classic game of blackjack, when the dealer's showing an ace and you don't have a 10 card value, you might be offered a chance for insurance, right? Because the dealer might have blackjack. Do you want to insure your bet? And people think, hey, insurance, that sounds good. This is the halo effect talking, right? Insurance sounds good. I like insurance. Let's hedge my bet. Don't do it, right? In a casino, insurance is a bad bet. Everyone knows it's a bad bet. Anyone who's a good seasoned gambler, assuming they're not counting cards, is never going to take insurance, right? It's a sucker bet. Don't do it. But it sounds good, right? It's described as insurance, and we like insurance. The halo effect is working here. If we described it as a sucker bet, who would take it, right? If the dealer said, who wants to place a sucker bet? No one. Because now it's exposed, right? Everyone's like, oh, I don't want to be a sucker. You get where I'm coming from. Okay, I'm going to skip the last of these things. We don't need to get into the odds, but they're there. Standard game of blackjack. Here's the last bias we're going to talk about real quick. And I just want to mention it because sometimes when we're thinking about heuristics, we have a heuristic in our head that says, follow authority, right? Do what they say. And in most cases, this works. If we're told to drive on the right side of the road, we should do it because that's what everyone's doing. If we're told to get in line, if we're told to evacuate a building, right? In most cases, obeying authority works out, right? There's millions of us. We're all living in a confined space and we got to get along. That requires rules. But there are limits, as Stanley Milgram showed in his experiments around obedience. This is a machine, the short version of my description of this, and I encourage you to look online and read about it. It's really quite fascinating. But what this experiment showed is that human beings will really go a long way, especially toward harming other human beings, if an authority figure says so, even when there's no explicit threat or no real threat, right? The subjects in this study could have walked out at any time, and yet they kept flipping switches, which at least they thought really were hurting another human being. It was all rigged. It was all staged. They were not, in fact, hurting another human being, but they thought they were, and they did it simply because person in lab coat said so. And the solution to this, and no one's questioning, right, whether we got to have some rules, but sometimes people react by doing the opposite. But the upshot is, when is it rational to disobey? We've got to think about these things, right? When you're in a situation where there's an authority figure, we have to kind of start thinking about the stakes. Are the stakes high or are the stakes low? If an authority figure says, hey, do you mind lining up over there? That seems pretty low stakes. But if an authority figure says, hey, I need you to do this thing that contributes to the harming of some big group, now I go, the stakes are much higher. Should I obey? Is this a good order? Is it a rational order? Is it a lawful command, right? There's going to be real questions we start to ask. It's hard to do, but this is when we should be engaging system 2, in other words. We should be more critical when the stakes start to get higher. So I worked through all this with you just so that we could talk through some of the things for this week. I hope it was at least a little bit helpful. To sum it up briefly, we're looking at examples of rules or heuristics, biases, that we do, we perform, we do them. Our mind does them. It's built into human nature to act on available information. It's built into human nature to judge things by salient characteristics, right? But we can go wrong sometimes when we do this. And if we know the situations where we're likely to go wrong, then that's a good situation to start adjusting our credences, to start adjusting our confidence. When things get emotionally charged, or when we're working with big numbers and thinking about odds, or when the stakes are high and there's an authority figure present, that's a case where we want to dial back our confidence, dial up system 2, and be a little more critical. We'll be less likely to make mistakes. I look forward to seeing you in the forum. Hope you're having a good week.